At the G7 summit in Italy, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said 19 words at a press conference, and within hours, the most powerful country in the world was trending for all the wrong reasons. Your understanding of American global power and how quickly it can be undermined may never be the same after you see what happened. Because this was not a trade dispute, not a tariff threat, not a sanctions package, it was a laugh. And that laugh is now being studied in foreign ministries from Tokyo to Berlin. Before we get into exactly what was said and why it landed the way it did, you need to understand what was already happening in that room before the cameras turned on. Because the 19 words were not the beginning, they were the answer. The G7 summit in Puglia, Italy is the kind of gathering where the choreography matters as much as the conversation. These are not casual meetings. Every seat at the table represents a government with its own domestic pressures, its own media cycle, its own red lines. Leaders arrive with prepared positions, coordinated talking points, and staffed communications teams ready to manage every word that comes out of their principal's mouth. The meetings are formal, the language is diplomatic, the optics are controlled, or they are supposed to be. According to multiple diplomatic sources who spoke to journalists covering the summit, during a closed working session on trade, President Trump interrupted Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's presentation. The words attributed to Trump, and these come from unnamed sources rather than any confirmed public record, so that distinction matters, were as follows. Nobody cares what Canada thinks about trade. Canada is a small country that is lucky we buy anything from them at all. Those words, if accurate, were spoken in a room that included the leaders of Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom. Not aides, not deputies, the actual heads of state. Now, Carney did not respond in the room. He gave no immediate counter. His team was briefed, the session continued. And then came the press conference. A Reuters journalist asked Carney about Trump's apparent dismissal of Canada's role in trade discussions. The exact framing of the question gave Carney the opening. And what followed was 19 words that a significant portion of the planet has now heard. Carney noted, calmly, that despite declaring Canada too small to matter, the President of the United States had spent 2 full years talking about almost nothing else. The laughter that followed did not come from the press gallery. It came from the stage. French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, the British Prime Minister, the Japanese Prime Minister. Heads of state seated publicly, laughing at a joke about the American president at a G7 summit. On camera, in real time. That is the moment you need to sit with. Not the words themselves, the response. Because when the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom openly laugh at a line that frames the American president as someone who cannot stop talking about the country he publicly dismissed, that is not a diplomatic incident. That is a verdict, and the whole world watched it get delivered. This situation has been developing faster than most mainstream outlets are framing it. If you want the full picture on stories like this, what the optics mean, what the policy consequences are, what the broader strategic shift looks like, subscribe now. This channel covers US and Canadian politics at the level of analysis that gets you ahead of the story, not behind it. Let's talk about what happened in the 30 minutes after the press conference ended, because that is where the story deepens. Trump responded on social media. He called Carney a failed banker. He threatened tariff increases. He attacked the leaders who had laughed. His own advisors had reportedly warned against any response at all. The guidance, according to reporting from people familiar with the internal White House process, was to let the moment pass, to say nothing, to allow the news cycle to move on. 3 separate, measured official responses were reportedly drafted. Trump rejected all 3, and in choosing to respond the way he did, he transformed a moment that might have faded by the next morning into a story that dominated the global news cycle for days. The clip was already at 90 million views before Trump's plane had left Italian airspace. Within 1 week, it had surpassed 300 million views. It trended number 1 in 43 countries. A Quinnipiac polling snapshot released in the days that followed found that 68% of Americans had seen the clip, 52% said they believed the mockery was deserved, and 58% of self-identified independents said the moment reduced their confidence in American global standing. That last number is the one political analysts have flagged as significant. Independents are the voters who decide American elections, and more than half of them looked at their president being laughed at by allied heads of state and felt less confident in the country's position in the world. For American viewers, here's what this means on a practical level. The United States conducts its foreign policy from a position of assumed authority. That authority is partly military, partly economic, but it is also reputational. It is the belief, shared by allies and rivals alike, that when Washington speaks, the words carry weight. When an American president walks into a multilateral room, the assumption built into the room is that the United States leads. That assumption has been tested repeatedly over the past several years. But what happened in Puglia was different. It was not a disagreement about policy. It was not a dispute about burden sharing in NATO or the pace of climate commitments. It was allied heads of state laughing, openly, on camera, in a coordinated moment, at the framing of the American president. The reputational cost of that is difficult to quantify, but its effects are already visible. 2 planned U.S. bilateral summit meetings were subsequently downgraded from presidential-level engagements to ministerial-level meetings. That is diplomatic language for, we will still talk, but we are no longer sending our top person to your top person. Japan's foreign ministry issued a statement that made headlines specifically for what it did not include: the standard diplomatic reference to U.S. global leadership that appears in virtually every prior joint communication with Washington. The European Commission president publicly and deliberately drew a distinction between importance and deference in the context of U.S.-Europe relations. These are not dramatic public breaks. They are quiet, careful recalibrations. And in the language of international diplomacy, quiet recalibrations are often more consequential than loud confrontations. For Canadian viewers, the moment carries a different kind of weight. Canada has spent the better part of 2 years navigating an extraordinarily difficult bilateral relationship with the United States under enormous economic pressure. Tariffs, trade threats, rhetoric about the 49th parallel, debates about Canadian sovereignty, and repeated suggestions from Washington that Canada exists primarily as an economic dependent of the United States. Canadian politicians have responded in various ways, with varying degrees of effectiveness. What Carney did in Puglia was different not because it was aggressive, but because it was precise. He did not lecture, he did not threaten, he did not hold a press conference about dignity or sovereignty. He made a single observation, in 19 words, that reframed the entire dynamic. If Canada is so unimportant, why has the most powerful person on earth spent 2 years being unable to stop discussing it? The logic was simple, the delivery was calm, and the effect was that the leaders of the world's major democratic economies laughed in agreement. That is a form of diplomatic leverage that does not appear in any trade agreement. It cannot be tariffed, it cannot be sanctioned. And it traveled to 300 million screens without Canada spending $1 on communications. Here is where we need to be careful, because not everything being said about this moment holds up to scrutiny. The words Trump allegedly spoke inside the closed session come from unnamed diplomatic sources. That is worth stating clearly. They have not been confirmed on the record by any named official or any verified document. The substance of what he reportedly said may be accurate, or it may be a version that has been shaped by sources with their own interests in how the story is framed. Carney's public response was real and documented. The laughter was real and documented. The viral reach was real and documented. What happened in the private session is sourced the way much sensitive diplomatic reporting is sourced, through people who were there or near there, speaking without attribution. That context matters. Similarly, the claim that this moment represents a permanent shift in allied diplomacy is an interpretation, not a confirmed fact. 2 summits being downgraded is notable. Japan's statement is notable. The EU Commission President's language is notable. But permanent realignment is a large conclusion to draw from a press conference moment, however viral it became. Diplomatic relationships between the United States and its G7 partners have survived serious fractures before. The institutions that bind them together are deep and structurally durable. What this moment clearly did is accelerate a conversation that was already happening in foreign ministries across the alliance. A conversation about how to engage productively with Washington when Washington's communication style has become increasingly unpredictable. Whether that conversation produces lasting structural change or gets absorbed into the normal rhythm of alliance management is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the political signal the polling numbers send. When nearly 6 in 10 American independents say a moment on a world stage reduced their confidence in U.S. global standing, that is not a diplomatic footnote. That is a domestic political problem. The administration built a significant portion of its political identity around the concept of American strength, the idea that a tougher, more confrontational posture on the world stage produces better outcomes for American workers and American interests. The question those independents appear to be asking after watching the Puglia clip is whether the posture is producing strength or producing isolation. That question does not go away with a social media post. Do you think Carney's response was a calculated strategic move, or simply a sharp answer to a fair question? And does it matter which one it was, given the outcome? That is a genuine debate worth having, because the answer tells you something about how power actually works in rooms where the cameras eventually turn on. The broader story here is about credibility as a form of currency. The United States has spent decades building the kind of diplomatic credibility that allows it to convene rooms, set agendas, and lead institutions. That credibility is not infinite. It is built through consistency, reliability, and the perception that engaging with Washington produces results. When allies begin to laugh at the framing of the American president, not in private, not in leaked diplomatic cables, but openly, on stage, in front of the world, it signals that some portion of that credibility has been spent. The question analysts and foreign ministries are now asking is not whether it happened. It is how much it cost and whether it can be rebuilt. Canada, for its part, is in a position it rarely occupies. A Canadian Prime Minister's 19 words are being analyzed in think tanks, foreign ministries, and editorial rooms from London to Seoul. Canada is not typically the country that lands the diplomatic punch that reshapes the conversation. It is typically the country that manages relationships carefully, maintains credibility quietly, and uses its position as a trusted middle power to create space for dialogue. What happened in Puglia put Canada on a very different kind of map. Whether that visibility serves Canadian interests long-term or creates new friction with Washington is a question that Canadian foreign policy advisors are actively working through right now. The stories that define diplomatic history rarely announce themselves as historic in the moment. They look, at first, like a press conference answer, a laugh, a clip that travels. And then, months or years later, you look back and recognize that the ground shifted. Whether Puglia is that kind of moment, whether it marks the point where allies began to renegotiate their assumptions about American leadership in ways that stick, remains genuinely open. But the signals coming out of Tokyo, Brussels, and Berlin in the days following suggest that foreign ministries are treating it seriously enough to adjust their approach. Stories like this one do not stay still. The follow-on decisions being made right now, in those foreign ministries, in the White House, in Ottawa, will determine whether this was a viral moment or a turning point. Subscribers to this channel will get that coverage as it develops, in full, with the context and analysis that the headline version leaves out. Subscribe now so you are in the room when the next chapter lands. The immediate tension here resolves clearly. A 19-word observation at a press conference in Italy traveled to 300 million screens, triggered polling shifts among American independents, prompted quiet diplomatic recalibrations in Japan and the European Union, and elevated Canada's voice in a global conversation about American leadership, at a moment when that conversation is already underway. That part of the story is documented and real. But here's the question this story opens that almost no one is asking yet. If allied governments are already renegotiating how they approach Washington, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the language of downgraded meetings and carefully omitted phrases, what happens the next time the United States needs those allies to move fast on something that actually matters? A security decision, a sanctions coalition, a military response. The laughter in Puglia was about trade and rhetoric. The next test will not be. In my next video, I am covering exactly that, how America's alliance architecture is being quietly stress tested on a set of decisions that have nothing to do with Canada. And what I found in the diplomatic record will change how you see where this is all heading.